During this presentation, we will discuss positive punishment. When I refer to the phrase positive punishment, I'm not implying that anyone enjoys punishing young children. The experience is certainly not entirely positive. Instead, psychologists utilise the term positive punishment to indicate dispensing something unpleasant, like a smack, and they utilise the term negative punishment to indicate withdrawing something pleasant, like withdrawing a chocolate. Now, typically, experts maintain that parents, psychologists, and other authorities should use reinforcement instead of punishment. That is, reinforcing desirable behaviours tends to be more helpful and ethical than punishing undesirable behaviours. But in many circumstances, some variants of punishment can be helpful and even necessary. And some children, as well as adults, respond more to punishment than reinforcement. That is, some people are more sensitive to punishments than rewards, and in these individuals, punishment is more likely than reinforcement to change their behaviour. Now, some variants of punishment are especially beneficial and effective. So one example is called positive punishment. And to illustrate, suppose a child does not implement a desired behaviour. A young girl, for example, might not have brushed her teeth, tidied her room, or completed her homework. As a punishment, the girl could be asked to complete the desired behaviour many times repeatedly. She might be asked to brush her teeth for 30 minutes, tidy her room and other rooms in the house for an hour, or complete hours more homework than perhaps the teacher had set. Now, positive practice generates several benefits as well as some drawbacks. In particular, the incessant repetition of this behaviour is unpleasant, and thus, like all punishments, should diminish the likelihood the child will repeat this behaviour in the future. But in addition, the incessant repetition might also enhance the skills or capabilities of this child. In this example, the child may be able to tidy her room or complete her homework more proficiently than before. Finally, the incessant repetition increases the likelihood this behaviour becomes automatic, like a habit, and therefore the child is more likely to initiate this behaviour quite effortlessly. The drawback, however, is the child will associate the behaviour with punishment. For instance, the girl might conceptualise brushing her teeth, cleaning her room, or completing her homework as punishments, as obligations rather than choices. She's therefore even less inclined to enjoy these tasks in the future. She's thus not as likely to persist on these tasks because her intrinsic motivation is limited. Now, besides positive practice, practitioners might dispense a practice called restitution. To illustrate, suppose a young boy damages some property, perhaps with graffiti or some other act, and as punishment, the boy may be asked to restore this property and perhaps adjacent properties as well. The boy, for example, might be instructed to repaint the fences he damaged. Restitution generates several benefits. First, restitution is obviously unpleasant and, like other punishments, will thus diminish the likelihood this child will repeat these acts in the future. Second, restitution offers the child or the perpetrators an opportunity to redeem themselves and behave desirably. After individuals redeem themselves, other people tend to treat them with more dignity. They're slightly more likely to be respected rather than denigrated. And this treatment can improve the behaviour of the child or perpetrators. That is, as many studies show, when people are treated as if they're honourable, they tend to behave more honourably in the future, called the Pygmalion effect. When people are treated as if they're malicious, they tend to behave more maliciously in the future. Third, restitution will tend to improve the surroundings and, for example, diminish the prevalence of graffiti. Interestingly, in regions in which graffiti is rampant, people are more inclined to violate the rules and laws of the land. That is, graffiti is a signal or clue that rules tend to be broken in this area. So unconsciously, people feel more inclined to violate rules and laws when surrounded by graffiti. They feel that such defiance of rules is more accepted in this vicinity. In contrast, after the surroundings are restored and the graffiti is removed, people are actually more inclined to observe the rules and laws of the land. Now, taken together, positive practice and restitution are examples of a concept called overcorrection. That is, overcorrection refers to instances in which the punishment entails acts that conflict with the original undesired behaviour. But besides overcorrection, other variants of positive punishment are occasionally applied as well. We'll consider a couple of effective examples. The first example is called contingent exercise. To illustrate, consider a girl who has lied to her parents. As a punishment, she might be instructed to engage in strenuous exercise, such as 10 push-ups or 20 sit-ups. This physical exercise is unrelated to the undesirable behaviour she committed, in this instance lying. So this physical exercise is not actually an example of overcorrection. Now, contingent exercise also generates a blend of benefits and drawbacks. The physical exercise, although unpleasant and thus punishing, is obviously healthy as well. For example, physical exercise tends to facilitate growth of the hippocampus, a region of the brain that's vital to memory and learning. Yet unfortunately, the physical exercise is likely to be perceived as a punishment in the future. The individual, therefore, might become resentful of exercise and may not be as physically active in the future. Now, the final example is called guided compliance. To illustrate, suppose you asked your son, a boy of 3 or 4 years of age, to tidy his room, but instead he merely throws objects around the room. To apply guided compliance, you would then model the behaviour once, perhaps placing one toy in the correct location. You'd then guide the hand of your son, perhaps while gripping his wrists, compelling him to retrieve and store a toy in the right spot. And so once your son begins to retrieve and store the toys himself, you could then release his wrists. Now, guided compliance generates a few benefits. Typically, guided compliance is unpleasant for the child who does not like to be restrained, and therefore, like most punishments, should diminish the undesirable behaviour in the future. But likewise, releasing the wrist is usually pleasant for the child and therefore reinforces the desirable behaviour. Of course, if the child likes this guidance, guided compliance is not an effective punisher, and releasing the wrist is not an effective reinforcer. In this example, you could even praise your son once he retrieves and stores the toys, even while you're guiding his behaviour. Now, this praise might seem unusual. After all, you're praising him even though you are completing most of the work, but nevertheless, this praise might still reinforce the right behaviour, in this instance, the retrieving and storing of the toys. In short, these positive punishments, positive practice, restitution, contingent exercise, and guided compliance can be effective. And furthermore, these practices don't seem as harsh or inappropriate as other punishments. But nevertheless, positive punishments are still unpleasant for the child and thus need to be governed by an ethical framework. Indeed, you should consider several complexities before you apply punishment. First, has informed consent been arranged? As an example, teachers should not punish children unless parents have approved this punishment. Admittedly, in practice, the teacher cannot readily seek informed consent every time a child needs to be punished. Instead, the school should prepare some guidelines on how they dispense punishments. They could stipulate the range of punishments they deliver and the circumstances in which these punishments may be delivered. Now, to optimise these guidelines, they should seek the opinions and perspectives of other principals, parents, academics, and other stakeholders. And finally, they should publicise these guidelines, so parents could thus challenge these guidelines if they chose. These guidelines should not only specify which punishments are dispensed and when these punishments are dispensed. In addition, these guidelines should include other information that assures the safety of children. For example, the guidelines could include information on risk management, such as how to identify children with medical conditions who might be especially harmed by punishments like contingent exercise. Likewise, the guidelines should include information on how the school assesses whether or not teachers comply with these practices. That is, how our teachers are trained, monitored, supervised, and evaluated. And finally, despite all of these measures, punishments should be regarded as a last resort. Authorities should apply punishment only after other alternatives, such as extinction, differential reinforcement, and antecedent manipulation, have been attempted.